And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. The AmCham Princeton Foundation is pleased to present today's discussion of the global economic outlook in light of the Ukraine conflict. Today, we're faced with unprecedented challenges in the globalized economy developed over the last 40 years. It's the most dramatic in the last 40 years. First, there was the COVID-19 pandemic, which disrupted national economies and disrupted specialized supply chains over the world. And now with the Ukraine conflict and the USA and European sanctions on the regime in Russia, the world is faced with shortages of key commodities such as oil, fertilizer, and grains. These risks are compounded by a general trend of high inflation throughout the developed world. Global institutions such as the United Nations, which were created to help develop with these kinds of situations, now seem inadequate. What's the global outlook for these conditions? What's the steps nations can take to mitigate economic harm? What are Russia's options under this new world? And how will developing countries be affected? These are the types of questions that we're going to be talking about today with our panelists from a wide range of backgrounds, from academia, from law, from business and technology, each offering a unique perspective. So I'm pleased to introduce David Thomas, MBE. He's the head of the international finance with Kochanski Partners, and was the head of HSBC in Poland, and is an expert in finance. Dr. Digby James Wren, director of the Mekong Research Project, a think tank in Cambodia, and a visiting scholar at Deakin University out of Australia. And he's coming to us from Cambodia. Dr. David Thomas is coming to us from Warsaw. We have Dr. Hassan Daud. He's the CEO of the Project Board of Investment and Trade, and he's a former diplomat, and former project director of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And we've got Dr. Doug Davis, who is CEO of DLD Davis Investments, and is a professor of telecommunications at Lincoln Law School and a research advisor with AmCham Princeton Foundation. And we've got Luis Davila, who's a former head of R.J. Reynolds International, the international division, and a member of the board of trustees of Depauw University in Greencastle, Indiana, as well as the chairman of the board marketing committee for the university. So, gentlemen, pleased to have you here. And we're going to start out with the first question to Dr. Hassan. What's brought about these changes in this insecurity, Dr. Hassan? What's the underlying root with that?
So thank you very much, and I'm sure you can hear me. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are, and for those of you who are listening to us on live. So I think to begin with, the world is going through numerous challenges, and these challenges for us, especially in where we are. I'm in China right now, and coming from Pakistan here, where we have unprecedented floods. So besides the climate change factor, the bitter politics, not letting us connect as much as we should, and that, as a matter of fact, has its economic impact. Then the COVID-19 challenges from the healthcare perspective to the economic perspective to the political standpoint, each one of them, I think there are numerous challenges, and this is one of the worst time I've seen. I mean, as a baby boomer, I have seen times and situations where things were worse, but now we have COVID at one side, we have this climate change issue. Floods in Pakistan have destroyed 80% of crops in one of the province, which was the main feeding province, and the tune of damage is around 2 billion. So just imagine for a less developed country, climate change, which produces less emission, more than any country in the region, has to face this, and then compounded by what is happening in between Russia and Ukraine in terms of its political impact, in terms of the supply chain impact, in terms of the food security's impact, in terms of the inflation impact. So then here you go with the economic downturn, and wherever you go, whoever you meet is talking about challenges. It's talking about risk. And I'm so happy that we are meeting today talking about some of these risks and how to mitigate those. And I believe that this is the time where global leaders and leaders from all walks and all spheres must get together and find solutions to problems. And this is again the time that I'm hearing things about, like either you're on our side or on their side, and this perhaps we thought has outlived its life. I'm again listening to narrative which was out and done. So,
Yep.
I'm happy that we will have experts speaking and talking to these challenges in terms of its economic dimension. But I would also like to discuss it later on the political
Sure.
aspect. Thank you.
No, definitely. So, Luis Davila, can you give us a macro outline of the state of the global economy on the eve of the invasion? So it started back in February, and what was the situation like then?
Luis is offline.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, then let's go down. I mean, can Dr. Digby Wren, can you just explain what the sanctions that were imposed on Russia in response to the invasion, what they were basically for the group here? Hello?
We can hear you, Dr. Digby.
Yeah, you can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. The beauty of live.
Yeah, that's getting better.
Maybe
Yeah,
I could
your audio.
read those, Ed, and then move on to my bit.
Yeah, let's go on. Okay, so David Thomas, you're an expert in finance. I mean, you've been in the industry. You have plenty of credentials. Can you discuss the impact the war has had on the global economy thus far?
Oh, okay. I mean, the big issue is timing. As we all know, the whole COVID pandemic has hit economies around the world quite extensively through lockdowns, especially, and then the problems with the supply network being hit with the sudden uptick in demand by people as they come out of the COVID crisis, and of course the just-in-time logistics models around the world just can't cope with sudden pressure from like a sausage machine pushing product through a network that just can't handle the additional volumes. So you had an economy which was not particularly stable because of that, had inflation in it because of those issues, had levels of debt which were very, very significant in governments because they were basically financing the shutdowns. And then we have a situation where the war starts. And quite frankly, it could well be that President Putin very much had this situation in his mind when he started the aggression, because he knew how unstable the global economy was. So we then have added into the mix the problem of a much stronger impulse into inflation caused by the cost of energy, directly impacted from the problems of delivery of gas, but more importantly, the manipulation of the energy markets by Russian players, which has driven up the cost of gas and oil, gas far more than oil, but oil also, to quite horrendous multiples. And that, of course, has immediately had an impact on, follow-on impact on inflation on other products, because the gas is either utilized directly as a raw material, such as in the fertilizer sector, or it's a critical input to manufacturing in terms of power inputs. So the manufacturing costs have moved very, very steeply upwards, and of course with the costs of the energy bills that are coming into everybody's doorsteps and homes for domestic energy prices, but also you've got to remember the energy prices for companies as well. The whole level of demand for products outside of basic products for energy, to keep warm, to heat water, to cook, have basically sucked free cash out of the domestic households to purchase other goods and services. So that is pushing directly onto the button of recession, because the demand has just collapsed in many, many countries. On the other side, you have countries where they haven't been able to get food because of the conflict. Ukraine and Russia together were supplying over 40% of wheat trade around the world, and it was especially important to Africa and the Middle East, that wheat trade, and add on to that corn, add on to that sunflower oils, and you've suddenly got a food crisis in these countries. So the hit has really been very, very considerable, and it's probably going to have an impact for a long time, especially when you start talking about fertilizers, because the cost of fertilizer actually impacts into food, usually with a year delay.
There's no audio.
Absolutely. No, thanks very much, David. And I'm going to go back to Luis Davila, who was able to join us. He's coming in from Newfoundland. So welcome to Luis Davila. Can you, Luis, give us the macro outline of the state of the global economy on the eve of the invasion, when it back in February of this year?
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for inviting me to join this conference. Look, there's no doubt in my mind anyway, and I think it's backed up by data, that the global economy was starting to slow already before the eve of the invasion. World Bank data showed that 2021 was about a 5.5% growth. It was expected to slow to 4% in 2022 and 3% in 2023, but certainly not dire. It was a slowdown as we're coming out of the pandemic. And this reflected intermittent COVID outbreaks. The exhaustion of pent-up demand, which was kind of keeping things flowing as we came out of the pandemic, or started to come out of the bad part of the pandemic. But again, it was kind of uneven in that, that's kind of the first world outlook, but much worse in the developing economies. But I think, and I missed some of the thing. I got disconnected, but certainly it's been compounded by what I think is a lack of leadership from the global powers to manage the world economy out of this, pandemic period, which in and of itself brought a lot of challenges.
Yeah, no doubt. Thank you, Luis. And then Dr. Digby-Wren, can you describe the sanctions that were imposed on Russia in response to the invasion? I mean, there were quite a few put on there, and that sort of was a catalyst for some of the economic issues that have flown from that.
I think Dr. Reynolds
I don't know if anybody can hear me.
There you go. You're in.
There we
Good.
I'm sorry if there's a technical issue, but I cannot hear anything. If you can hear me, I'll just proceed.
Yep.
It
Please
should
do.
be noted from the start that the success and failure of economic sanctions has a cyclical pattern, with waves of optimism followed by stick views on the effectiveness and usefulness of sanctions, targeted or smart sanctions. 100 years ago, economic sanctions were seen as a very effective foreign policy tool. But the Lehman's announcement of the terrible weapon suggested that they could become a substitute for war. But Woodrow Wilson said just after the 1919 Versailles conference that a nation that is boycotted is a century later, the sanction against
I think we're having some trouble here.
Yeah.
I know that Luis Davila, I mean, one of the follow-up questions was, are these sanctions working?
I think the short answer is no. If by working we mean is it causing Russia to rethink what they're doing? Well, the fact is no. But having said that, it certainly is having a crippling effect, I believe, on the Russian economy. We know more than 30 countries have imposed sanctions against Russia. It's cut energy imports. It's blocked financial transactions, halting shipments of key imports, semiconductors, electronics. We know that over 1,000 foreign companies have left Russia since the sanctions were imposed, and that's had a tremendous impact on their economy. I believe that those foreign companies account for almost 40% of their GDP. Now, what we're hearing from Russia is different, typical of a political demagogue. If you say it enough, maybe people will believe it. But the fact is, and this is supported by a Yale University study, that the Russians' position as a commodities exporter has been irreversibly eroded. The study says that Russian imports have largely collapsed since the war began, and that the country is facing very stark challenges securing crucial imports such as parts, technology. Domestic production has come to a complete standstill with no capacity to replace lost businesses, products, or talent. The report also says that what the government is doing is resorting to unsustainable fiscal and monetary intervention. So bottom line, again, looking at this Yale study, it's working in that it's crippling them. It's not working that it hasn't stopped their actions. Now, having said that, my question would be, we knew, or the West supposedly knew from intelligence reports, that this invasion was going to happen. Why didn't we start the sanctions before? Once it happens, what can be done? So as far as sanctions working, it certainly would appear that as hard as the realities are for the Russian economy based on these sanctions, the war continues and the damage has been done.
Right. Thanks, Luis. And, Doug Davis, as a result of the conflict, are supply chain makeovers inevitable? And I know you're CEO of a business. What have you seen on the ground? Besides being a professor, but I'm saying you're in the business world. So,
well, the reality is we were having supply chain issues long before the war. COVID, pretty much everybody felt it, no matter where they were. You were looking for toilet paper, you were looking for other things. It was everybody knew there was a supply chain issue. It didn't matter what industry or what sector or anything. So everybody had issues. That hasn't changed. It's gotten worse. The Russian invasion triggered and sanctions have really killed the logistics chains. The trade routes have changed. A lot of the stuff that everybody set up during COVID has moved around. The part supplies that come out of China and out of parts of Europe have slowed down, so the trains can't get where they're going. And so these entire partner ecosystems that were developed before COVID have changed, and then they have developed after COVID have changed, and now we've got a war that changed. So they keep changing. The transportation routes that used to go from Europe to China took a big hit after the Russian invasion, because there's stuff in the way where people are shooting at each other, and they don't like to run the trains through those areas. So that was a competitive route for years and years, and now you've got all this stuff stalled out. So they're having to come up with yet another route, another way around to get stuff there. And so that's what the advice I keep hearing when I talk to my advisors, and when, of course, people ask me my opinion, is that this planning on these trade routes can only get you so far now. It used to be you knew that if you bought a container and put it on a boat or put it on a train, it would show up. You could set your clock to it, and it would be there more or less within that time frame. Nowadays, who knows? And the costs are sky high. In 2018, it cost me maybe $1,200 to move a container from China to the U.S. Now I'm lucky if I can move one for $10,000, sometimes $7,000. It's just insane. And when I get it somewhere that nobody can load it and nobody can put it back, can put anything on it, or they can't unload it, or they can't get it to the train because the train's not there. So you've got all sorts of stuff, and the advice is to not plan as hard as you used to, and start to learn how to pivot. Start to learn how to realize that things are moving and changing, and this doesn't appear to be anything that's going to slow down. Everybody nobody expected the pandemic. Nobody expected the Russian invasion, and so here we are. And what's the next thing? And how are we going to plan for that? And how are we going to become agile with our transportation needs to prevent these kind of things from happening in the future, or at least mitigate them?
Great. No, thanks for that answer, Doug. And I mean, that was insightful. Let's pivot here for a second ourselves. I mean, Dr. Hassan, now you were director of the Pakistan-China Economic Corridor, and you've had the benefit of working with China's Belt and Road Initiative projects. So how do you think the global regional integration initiatives can help address these challenges arising from the Ukraine conflict? And what role do you think the Belt and Road Initiative can play in a post, COVID-19 situation, with all these challenges?
I think Dr. Hassan is offline again. Let's see if
Okay.
he's back.
I'm there.
There he is. There he is. Yeah, he's back.
Welcome back, Dr. Hassan. I don't know if you heard the question, but you
No, I
were
didn't,
direct.
but I was sure it's my turn now, so I'm glad that I'm back. And
Okay. Okay, welcome back. So it's about the Belt and Road Initiative. I know you've played a big part in that, being a director of the Economic Corridor. So, what role is the Belt and Road? What might they do in playing a role in post COVID-19, and Pakistan specifically, I guess, as well? I think we've lost him.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We'll just keep rolling along here. On Doug Davis, let's go back to you. Is it myth or reality that Russia can simply redirect natural gas exports to Asia? What do you reckon?
It's a little bit of both. So, the European market for natural gas is huge compared to what Russia can get to Asia. So the competition in the market there in Asia will never give Russia the buying power. We've got too many other sources for this. Russia really only started to supply natural gas to the Asia Pacific region in 2009, which, from a global standpoint, isn't very long ago. And that was, all compressed liquid, what they call LNG, liquid natural gas. But it's very small. In 2021, Russia sold 33 billion cubic meters to the Asian countries. compared to the 20 billion or 200 billion it sells to the European countries. And that was really before all the shooting started. So sorry, I had audio problems on my end. Most of this of the 33 billion, most of this 10%, 10 billion of it, about 1/3 of it, went to China through the Siberian pipeline. Went through China, but then ended up in Japan and Korea. So getting more to these Asian countries is going to be very difficult. And there's a lot of projects that Novatech has in play, but Novatech is primarily financed by the Kremlin, and we don't know what's going to happen with the Kremlin's pocketbook. They've got a war to finance right now, and how much of that gets put on to these supply chain issues, and how much of that gets put into buying more guns is a big question coming up.
Yep. I don't know if is Dr. Hassan Daud back on, or is that not?
He's coming on right now. So
there we go. Hey, Dr. Hassan. I mean, we'd like to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative and how that might play into this whole situation. Is it positive, negative? Is it going to be something that will be playing out in a country you're from as well, Pakistan? Maybe not. Okay, let's go over. Let's go over to David Thomas. I'm not sure if Dr. Hassan was back on, but David Thomas, is it a myth or reality that the Russian economy and domestic consumption are strong?
Okay, well, Russia was as a total economic entity in 2021 was ranked number 11 in the world, which would suggest it's a significant size economy, in fact, very large economy. But if you take out the energy industry from that, it's a really small economy. And as Lewis was saying, a lot of the domestic economy, some 40%, was actually being contributed by Western countries or Western companies that have since withdrawn from Russia. And okay, you have now Russian McDonald's and various other Russian replacements for these international companies, but the hit to the non-oil and gas part of the economy has been really quite severe. What's very interesting is a recent statistic coming out of Germany, which shows that German pharmaceutical supplies have actually doubled in the last 6 months to Russia, which is interesting when there's meant to be a boycott from the West, but that's another issue. But it shows that the domestic pharmaceutical businesses in Russia can't manufacture for whatever reason, and they're having to supplement from Germany. This boycott of Western technology is really hitting Russian manufacture, and there's no way that's going to change in the near future. But also, food imports have been hit. Around about 40% of Russian food supplies came from Ukraine and Central Europe. Well, that's all gone now. So you've actually had a very large hit on the domestic economy, which has actually driven consumption down. Now, for everyday Russians, their consumption levels are nowhere near as high as an average Western European person, but they are certainly feeling the hit in terms of their possibility for consumption, more from the supply side than in fact the money in their wallet, basically because the Russian government has been pumping money into the economy at a rate of knots. Officially, the economy has only been hit by a 4.3% contraction to July of last year. But as again, Lewis was saying, nobody really believes the numbers that the Russian government is putting out. And the last issue, of course, is with Putin announcing his partial mobilization. You're taking yet more men of productive age that actually were in jobs producing things out of the economy, which is going to have another downward blow onto production and therefore economic output. So it's only going to get worse.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's a mouthful. Is Dr. Hassan Daud, is he back on, or is or Dr. Digby Wren, or anybody there?
Yeah, Hassan's back on. I don't know if he's got audio yet.
Okay. Okay. Well, let me just do a follow-up question. If Dr. Hassan Daud is not on audio yet, just a quick question, David Thomas, about China. I mean, what role do you think that China might be playing in this at all? What's your perspective? You're in Poland right now. I mean, what's the feeling there? What role does China play? Is it positive, negative? Is it nondescript? What do you reckon?
From the Polish perspective, the government views China's role as potentially key. Its activities up till now don't seem to be encouraging Putin to go one way or another. I mean, they're not really criticizing Putin, certainly not publicly, and they don't seem to be supplying weaponry, really increasing the consumption of Russian gas and oil to that large amount to be sort of supporting his war effort that much. It seems as though they're sort of sitting on the sideline waiting to see what's going to happen. But they have a potential pivotal role if they want to use it.
Sounds good. Yeah, the Luis Davila, despite the sanctions that have prolonged and the prolonged conflict in the Ukraine, what's your feeling on economies bouncing back? I mean, is anything happening in Ukraine or in Russia? I mean, I know it's David Thomas talked a little bit about that, but anything we want to add?
I mean, I would just confirm what David said. Anything arguing that, especially the Russian economies bounce back, just is not factual. By any metric and on any level, the Russian economy is reeling from the sanctions. Although Putin will cherry pick, and insist that everything is fine. The true facts, I think, show otherwise. I think they're facing a long and deep economic problem or long recession as the U.S.-led sanctions and U.S. and European-led sanctions continue. And again, this all assumes that people stay in line, if you will. But I mean, the scenarios that experts see regarding economic recovery for Russia is that it's going to take a long time. 2 of 3 scenarios by experts show that contraction is accelerating next year. With the economy that may be returning to pre-war level only by the end of the decade. So that seems quite dire for Russia and the Russian people. And obviously the add-on impacts that it has for the rest of the world. I mean, Ed, you said at the beginning, we've created this global economic system over the last 40 years, I've personally, and as an international businessman for 40 years, think it was a great thing for the world economy to see this globalization. But as I said earlier, what we're seeing is that political leadership has not been able to take this globalization and turn it into a positive for the world. And as a matter of fact, what we're seeing now is basically a lot of neo-nationalism, which is really eroding global trade. It's having impacts. Again, there's been impacts that caused by the war, caused by COVID, but a true global leadership, I think, would have helped mitigate a lot of these impacts.
Yeah, and just a quick follow-up. I mean, you studied political science. I think you're the only one in the group who did. So, I mean, and you went to a liberal arts university. I mean, what's your feeling on a solution from a political perspective? I mean, what's have you given it much thought? I mean,
well, I'll start with the definition of politics. I mean, it's about influence, isn't it? It's about influencing policies, et cetera, to achieve the goals and the objectives that you want to achieve. You know, as I said, if we're seeing, especially among global leaders like the U.S., China, Russia, and again, someone mentioned that Russia was only 11th in the world economically. Well, that's still 11th. But Russia has an oversized influence in the world versus the size of its economy, in my opinion. So these political powers that have influence have to learn to work together, and you can disagree and still work together. And I think that's has to be the solution. You know, look, I was speaking to a group of university students last year, and about international business and the global economy. And I told them a story. You know, when in 1960, I moved to Japan. My father was in the military. It took me 10 hours to get from San Juan, Puerto Rico to San Francisco, 10 hours from San Francisco to Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, 10 hours from Hickam Air Force Base to Wake Island in the middle of the Pacific, and 10 hours from Hickam to from Wake Island to Tachikawa Air Force Base just outside of Tokyo. So 40 hours to cross the Pacific. When we arrived there and we called home in Puerto Rico to tell them that we had arrived okay, my mother, I remember, placed the phone call, and the operator, remember those? The operator
Yes.
said, "Okay, we'll have your call for you. We'll have your call for you next Wednesday." Okay. You know, fast forward to when I was in China, living in Beijing. It took me 13 hours to fly from Chicago. My office in China was set up as if it was an extension of my U.S. office, so people could call just dialing an extension number from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and be talking to me. And when my personal thing, when my daughter went into labor, I jumped on a plane and was almost home in time to greet my first grandchild. The point I'm making is that the world is so small today versus what it was 50 years ago. And it's so interdependent that leadership, especially of the major powers, has to understand that it is in the best interest. You know, America first. Yeah, if as an American, I would say America first. If I was Chinese, I'd say China first. But what has to be understood is that to get the best for your country, you also need to be able to do things together with the other political and economic influencers in the world to make it all work. And unfortunately, with what I see as neo-nationalism taking over a lot of these major powers, doesn't seem to be a lot of interest in working with others, but rather staying inwardly focused. And that's going to be a problem as we face these challenges that we're seeing today.
Yep. Thank you very much for that share. I appreciate it. Dr. Hassan Daud, are you with us now, or in all
Yeah, I'm
ways?
absolutely with us all the way, and this is something like so important for us, especially for the developing countries.
Yeah,
So
tell me a little
go
bit
ahead
about
with your.
with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative. I know you were the director of the Pakistan-China Economic Corridor. So, I mean, how does BRI going to be playing a role in that, and how is this impacting third world countries? This conflict.
I think taking on from where Lewis ended, and perhaps giving my own experience and sharing the importance. In the last 7 to 10 years, in terms of regionalization, we were hoping for expecting a lot in terms of socioeconomic development, in terms of rural urban synergy, infrastructure development. Because despite the fact that we have good agriculture, we had good agriculture, and there are countries who are doing well. Still, we need there's a lot of interdependence. There's still a requirement of connectivity, seamless trade, and you when you have a country like Afghanistan right in the middle of Belt and Road Initiative, there are challenges, and these challenges can only be addressed through cooperation, through discussion, through people to people interaction, and also through leadership, as was actually highlighted by some of the speakers. And we need more pragmatism. We need more forward-looking approach in terms of how what kind of world that we would like to give to our children, and what kind of you know I now hear from investors talking about from the US talking about shortening of China, and these things won't work. You can't just shorten China and its influence in Asia. And we have the BRICS now, middle income countries becoming stronger in terms of economic decisions. We have the SCO now becoming important. We have the Belt and Road Initiative, and now most recently the Global Development Initiative of China. And all these, if they gel together through regional integration, I think the world would be a better place. But sadly, what we see now is that the globalization is coming enormous stress test, and this stress test is actually reshaping some of the hopes that we had sitting in the developing world. And I think the populist political approach is now making all these initiatives look like rhetoric as in terms of its implementation. But I'm still hopeful. I am in China, and I'm in the place where people are setting up new offices, investment is coming. They are taking decisions which are unprecedented. Interest rates are being lowered. They have this CCP meeting coming up in October. So there's a lot of hope in China, and I see when China grows, the region grows, and when the region gets connected, the economic growth gets better. So I think the leadership should have to be more selfless, more forward-looking, and more. When I say leadership, I mean leadership of the big economies. They should sit together, because now look at Pakistan, and I just take one more minute. Look at Pakistan. We are facing the brunt of, in terms of climate change. We are having floods, and we feel that it's because of some of the larger economies, the kind of carbon discharge that they produce. We don't do that. We do not pollute the world as much as some of the bigger economies do. So I think ideas need to come together, people need to come together, trade and business need to come together, and economies need to be interlinked. If we don't do that, I think we see more challenging time coming ahead.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up question on what you said. So, I mean, yeah, there has been rumor or there has been discussion. I mean, that they're going to take advantage of this uncertainty to do something like sell China short. I mean, because of the situation, the world situation, the following on COVID and everything else. So your feeling, and you stated earlier that you didn't think that was the case. You get something like George Soros did with the pound, or George Soros tried to do in with 1997 at the handover in the Hong Kong dollar. But you're not. You just came to Beijing just within a week or so ago, right? But the feeling is outside that there's confidence that people aren't going to be selling China short. Is that your opinion, Dr. Daud, Dr. Hassan?
Well, I thought you were asking question. No, I think.
Yeah, I was asking it of you. I'm sorry. Sorry about that.
Yeah,
Following up on
absolutely.
you mentioned it in
No,
there. Yeah.
since we converge in ideas, I think name doesn't matter. So I think George Soros's statement on shortening of China, or any other, as I said, anyone from the West speaking about shortening of any country, perhaps more so for China, but I think no, it's not speaking in the interest of global peace. It's not speaking in the interest of global economies, because we need more interdependence. And why we need those? Because agriculture products, food security, and all these aspects need to be worked together. And look at just one conflict. This Russia-Ukraine has actually disturbed the overall global supply chain. And if it continues to happen, and if we speak more on political issues, more on shortening of China, more on shortening of Asia, perhaps, I think this won't work. I believe that countries need to sit together. We are having the UN session as we speak, and I think global leaders, in not just highlighting and talking about rhetoric, should talk about actionable standpoints, and those actionable points should be reflected and echoed in terms of economic decisions. It cannot just now be speaking about high words and supreme initiatives. As a matter of fact, it's about action now. It's time that and just give me a second on what I'm saying. And I think we need to, as a matter of fact, discourage uh, big investors, big economic players speaking about politics more. They should speak about economic decision making. They should speak about investing in regions and in areas where the world could be better placed, like green energies. We should be talking about that. We should be talking about climate change more, as opposed to talking about shortening of China.
Right.
It
No,
won't
very
help,
good.
I think.
That's very good. No, it's thank you very much for that. I mean, is Digby Wren? Is Dr. Digby Wren? Has he been able to rejoin us with some?
I hope you can hear me this time.
Yes, we
We're
can.
having
Yeah,
some technical problems
Perfect,
here in
perfect.
Cambodia.
great. Yeah, and since you're in Cambodia, I mean, is it reality or myth that Russia is going to be replacing the reduced imports from the West with imports from Asia? I mean, do you reckon that that's the case? I mean, you're sitting in Cambodia. What's your thought process?
Well, yeah. Well, look, July's exports to Russia were driven by East Asia. July deliveries of goods and services from China increased to, I don't know, $7 billion, which is, quite a big improvement, about 22% over the month before. But that's still 17% or 20% less than the year before. But look, it is increasing, and it is slightly offsetting what's happened, with the loss of with the sanctions. Supply chain, water. I mean, they all the way to run down to the sea. So you can be sure, and I think this has been proven with the Indians and with the Chinese and with others, that that Russia is going to be able to find alternative ways to sell its commodities and other products after that and elsewhere. And internally, of course, it is crippling. I think the technical or the technology sanctions are going to hurt them a lot. So they're going to be looking for imports from Asia of electronics and technical technologies that are going to replace Western technologies over time. And I think that may play into China's hands, that may play into East Asia's hand, may play into Southeast Asia. So, not that Cambodia exports much in terms of technology, but certainly ASEAN countries do. And I think that the Russians were looking to do that, and the Americans will be trying to extend the sanctions into ASEAN to have them stop that. But this is a sort of a strange game, cat and mouse kind of idea with the supply chains. That is just going to be ongoing. There is no way to totally embargo or block pretty well any country in the world today, and I think you can see that with Iran and Venezuela and other countries. That's virtually impossible, and it's yet to be seen what's going to happen in Europe when winter's in, how difficult that might be. And one always has to remember that after the midterms in November, the Americans' willingness to continue a very high level of sanctions may weaken somewhat. That's yet to be seen. But look, I think Turkey has been quite active also in its relations with Russia, and that's got to be a worry for the NATO partners. And look, in fact, even EU exports have actually slightly increased to Russia, which sort of seems counterintuitive, but that's actually what has happened. A large Hong Kong law firm released a small report on Russia a couple of weeks ago, mentioning how the EU exports to Russia had increased. And I think that overall, that the losses are still not replaced. But this is about, the qualitative problems, raw materials, components, investment. So investment's obviously not going to happen at all. And secondary sanctions may have an effect on the other nations, but that this time that hasn't happened. Difficulties with logistics, but logistics going east are not too problematic for Russia actually. So that may play with the Belt and Road, of course, comes into there. Those connections in East Asia into China directly of commodities. There's a number of pipelines there, and that's not going to be affected. And I think the same is true of Kazakhstan and a few other countries. The SCO meeting just a week ago, even though there was nothing released about that, there were certainly discussions about how supply chains would be maintained into Asia. So that's very, very important. Look, I suppose I just want to make one more comment about sanctions, and that is that mostly they don't work.
Right.
There's a lot of academic literature about that, and it's sure that there's, it's going to have, and it has had a very negative effect on the Russian economy. But as I said, it's like water. They're going to find alternatives. There are alternatives. And the cost of maintaining such a high level has never been tested before, actually. Look, I think that the US capacity to maintain such a high level with its own problems may also come into question eventually. And definitely in Europe, that is it's not as popular as everybody might think. If you believe Western media reports, you would imagine that Putin's going to collapse immediately and he's going to threaten to nuclear action immediately and so forth. But look, this is really not exactly what's going on. It's not. And I think that this may take a lot longer. As one of the other guests said, this is a long game. It's going to take a long time. And whether or not that can be maintained by the European Union, I think is doubtful. Whether it can be maintained by the US is another matter. But as Biden has said on a number of occasions, if the US does not have Europe as a very strong partner, then it won't happen. Eventually it will fall apart. And I think that's, nothing really may change between now and November. Other than the Russians are going to definitely increase their military activities. And even those reports, the military activity reports, one has to be very careful about that as well. There were some reports from generals that were published that was not widely spread in Western media, that actually the Russians had willingly withdrawn from certain areas and it wasn't a great Ukrainian victory. So I think, one needs to be very, very careful about this and remember that these, the necessities of the markets and the trade are going to continue. And sanctions can't stop that completely and fully. So I would.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think we just lost you there for a moment. Doug Davis, I mean, I guess this has been touched on by some of the other panelists, but is it a reality or myth that the Kremlin has a lot of money available and can rely on cash reserves to get through this thing?
Well, it's kind of interesting. There was a report in 2021 that said that the Russians had about 131 billion in gold, with about 612 billion reserves held up in foreign currency assets. In May, they were around 534 billion, and it's down to about 500. It's now down to about 565 billion. Excuse me, 584 billion. Now it's down to 565. So they're burning through about 8 to 10 billion a month, supporting the war in their economy. So that is, part and part a result of the sanctions, but also just the reality of this protracted engagement that they're involved with. The central bank in Russia is talking about using more foreign currencies, and specifically they're talking about the Chinese yuan, but they don't have access to it all. And that's going to be interesting coming soon, because 600 billion of all of this, of their war chest, is frozen up in the US, UK, and EU. And they've started a lawsuit to try and unfreeze all this. But, Venezuela did the same thing a few years back, and that didn't work out so well for them in the UK in 2021. They didn't get their money. So this next few months, coming into December, January, February, are going to be kind of a popcorn moment to watch and see whether people are going to give them the money they've frozen, to see if they can continue to shoot at each other.
No doubt. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the European Union and that, with the conflict and what that's going to do with energy. What's it like from the United States? I mean, I'm sitting in Asia. I mean, what's the viewpoint of the United States about the impact of just the average person on the conflict? And is that causing economic effect? I mean, is the blame getting blamed on the Biden administration or on this or all things? What's the feeling there? Just out of curiosity.
Well, we're so divided in this country now. For years and years of people working to divide the country. Half the country blames Biden, half the country blames Trump, and half the country blames China. So I mean, it's just they're all over the map here. By and large, it's hard to tell, because we've got all the strategic reserves of oil that's being released. We're coming into an election cycle, so gas is going down. Everybody's doing the kumbaya. They're not paying $5 a gallon or $8 a gallon. They're paying $3 a gallon. But that's because we're letting loose some of our strategic reserves. So we're artificially deflating this stuff. The average person on the street, they're more worried about their 401k right now, because our stock market's been taking such a beating. And there's all sorts of reasons for that and speculations for that. But by and large, this conflict is playing a role on it. And we'll talk later about some of the shortages that we're starting to see that are really impacting the average person, if you will, on the street.
Exactly. So let's go to David Thomas. I mean, how's the impact of the conflict? I mean, how is it affecting the economic outlook? I mean, I guess, what's your feeling on that? It doesn't seem bright.
No.
You're the banker. So.
Yeah. Well, just before I do that, let's also focus a little bit on what could well happen in the next few months in Ukraine. I'm afraid I don't agree with Digby that the Russians pulled out to allow the Ukrainians to advance. And if you actually look at the amount of weaponry that Russia left behind, it certainly wasn't an organized retreat. And that, I think, is an element that we need to think about quite significantly in terms of what the impact of the conflict could well have going forward, because there is a growing amount of discussion, certainly in Central Europe, and from my knowledge also in the United Kingdom, that we could well see quite a hard and large new counteroffensive coming from Ukraine in response to this series of referenda that are being put forward, which is, if that does happen, we're either going to have quite a major escalation, or, as I certainly think Ukrainians hope, it'll just finally break the back of the Russian attack and hopefully resettle everything back to fairly normal boundaries. But we'll just have to see. But the issue is that we're facing a situation where the major Western economies are pretty close to, or have actually tilted over the edge of recession. The Bank of England announced on Friday that when it put up interest rates to 2%, that they believe that the UK was already in recession. We certainly got inflation soaring everywhere, and that's not really going to change. And the food shortages are likely to continue because we have the problems of the supply chains and the the non-dependency of the global supply chain now, which with food, of course, becomes quite critical, especially perishable food. But we really have a problem with Ukraine and Russia not taking part pretty much now in global trade of foodstuffs, which is going to really compound the situation. And of course, Ukraine hasn't. A lot of Ukraine, the farmers haven't been planting their fields because of various bombs and missiles that have been landing in their fields. So, we're going to have this problem going on for a few years yet.
Yep.
Central banks are going to continue to increase interest rates to try to bring down this inflation. Which of course will have an impact, which is what it's meant to have, the impact on demand, which is the main reason for them controlling inflation, because the demand isn't there, but also it'll reduce investment. So that will also have a longer term impact going forward, because the investment that will be held back will affect production in years to come. What I find interesting is Oxford Economics has released a new report, revised report, which is showing that global growth will actually be down at 2.8% in 2002. That's compared to the 4.3% that the World Bank was saying. And they're predicting 2023 global growth being at 1.7%. So we're looking at the global economy coming almost to stagnation, which is quite a significant issue. And actually, if you balance things out, if you've got a 1.7% global growth, it means that in OECD countries, you've got recession, because that's about the only way it balances out across the world. So we could be facing quite a horrendous period coming forward.
Wow. Okay. And following on that, I mean, Luis, Davila, I mean, just with what David has just said, I mean, the war in Ukraine is obviously causing food and fuel crises. I mean, if it isn't present now, I mean, it's coming down the road. What are your thoughts on that?
Certainly, the war is caught. I mean, we've talked about all the supply chain issues. Certainly, when you look at the grain exports out of Ukraine, I mean, this is causing some food issues. Smaller supplies and higher prices for food mean that especially the world's poor are going to suffer, and this is based on WTO reports. Sharply rising commodity prices, I think, have been one of the most immediate impacts of the Ukrainian conflict. The war, I think, also threatens supplies of essential goods, and we've talked about this throughout the call. from Russia and Ukraine, including food, energy, and fertilizers. So most definitely, there are going to be major impacts on both food shortages. Again, focus probably more on the poorer countries, as the WTO is warning. So I think it's been said already. This is we're looking at a long period of, I'm gonna be optimistic and call it recovery. But it's not something that's going to just turn around and happen the day the aggression stops or the war stops. It's going to take some time to get things back to normal. And I will also say, and I'm not an economist by any stretch of the imagination. I'm probably one of the people on the panel has the lowest level of education. I try to call myself a pragmatist. I'm also concerned about the monetary action being taken by central banks, because I think they're using the old playbook. There's inflation. Therefore let's make money tighter. But they're not recognizing the causes of this inflation. And we've had a perfect storm: the pandemic, the conflict in the Ukraine, all the disruption that's had on supply, on the supply chains. So I think in some cases, I believe, and again, this is my belief, that especially here in the U.S., the Fed is overdoing it in terms of these very rapid and high increases in the rates. And certainly in my mind, there will be no soft landing, not with the actions that they're taking.
Mm-hmm. Just to follow up, I mean, Digby, what like food policy considerations do you think might be implemented to make things better? I mean, with third world countries?
Look, food policy is very important, and as Luis has just mentioned, the world's poor, of course, are the ones that are going to suffer the most. Now, for example, we all know that cascading events here, far-reaching consequences for global food security, and everybody's talking about that, especially in the United States and in Europe and in Australia and other places. But really, the food security problem is not there. The food security problem is in the Horn of Africa and some other places in Africa, some in the Middle East, and North Africa relies in a very large way on food and grain coming from the Ukraine and Russia. So for them, this is a much more severe problem. Now, there's about 400 million people who are at this time today in significant trouble. I don't know if you can.
Oh, I think we lost Digby. David Thomas, can you come in? I'm sorry, Doug Davis. Would you mind just talking a little bit about food policy as well? Just while we've lost Digby.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk some about it. I mean, there's a lot of issues in food policy that have come up from this now. There's shortages in the low-income companies like Africa and places like that. The Ukraine and Russia account for about 1/3 of the wheat and barley production, and about 75% of the sunflower oil production out there. The combination of this Russian sanctions and blocked Ukraine reports and the inability of the Ukrainian farmers to work their fields because things are falling from the sky and they're not real motivated, is creating kind of a perfect storm there. And you asked earlier about the States, and in the States we can see it. And people don't know that this is happening because we're in America, we don't really understand our supply chains, but we go to the grocery store and we get something that's happy. Things like chickpeas and wheat are harder to find out there because that's where they came from. They came mostly from the Ukraine and from the Russian areas that have been blocked. And then you've got other issues where you've got side effects, like in Brazil, they diverted sugar over to produce ethanol, and so the sugar prices have risen worldwide because they were a major exporter. And so that's that's the kind of thing that's an indirect cause, as just an example. And then you've got pulp supplies. So all these sanctions, everything. I hope they're not written down on paper, because the Ukraine was one of the bigger producers and exporters of pulp. So they're into Europe. So all these things are there, and they're having to close these gaps, and that's raising all the prices. And then the last thing that's going on, which is we do hear in the news periodically, is the cyber attacks that are happening. JBS, which is the world's biggest meat packer, suffered a huge cyber attack and ended up paying the criminals $11 million to get things back up and running. And quite honestly, we're terribly unprepared for this. The food industry in particular has not spent the money to bolster up cybersecurity, so it's always been an issue there. And then you've got the exit from the pandemic and all the labor shortages. So, every piece of the supply chain, from pickers to packers to transportation to retailers, everybody out there is lying flat right now, and they don't want it, and they're not working. And so you've got all these kind of coming together to create this perfect storm of things wrong in the food supply that we are just seeing now, but are going to be a major impact next year.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. No, that's what I'd like to do. I mean, we've had a really interesting discussion so far, but I'd like to kind of go around the panel here. I mean, towards the end, and I'll start with Dr. Hassan. But what's your prediction for the new normal coming out of the pandemic and the Russia conflict? And what, again, I'm going to go through each of the panelists on this. And what's your advice on policymakers around the world seeking to promote a democratic and secure kind of world order and promoting, a prosperous future? Dr. Hassan?
Yeah, I think he's offline again.
We've lost him.
Had
Okay.
really bad connection today.
Okay, so I'm going to go to David Thomas, please. What's your thought?
Well, I think we're likely to move away from globalized production and globalized trade. Not necessarily because people want to, but it's basically going to be because it's the only way that they will be able to manage the supply chains. I mean, trying to manage global supply chains right now seem to be absolutely impossible. So we're going to have to shorten the supply lines, whether they become regional supply lines or even smaller than regional supply lines. I've got a feeling we'll see a trend that way.
David Thomas, do you see that the dollar is going to get replaced with crypto or with the yuan, the digital yuan, or do you see? I mean, you've spent a lifetime in finance and the banking industries. I mean, is that possible? Do you see that as a new normal?
I don't think that is the future in terms of cryptocurrency taking over. But the present foreign exchange system is almost as broke as the global supply chain system, and we need to do something to try to bring the whole system into a lot more manageable, usable structure. Right.
And you would agree also with Dr. Hassan Daud about this, that you don't see people selling China short. I mean, amidst all this kind of turmoil with the Russian-Ukraine conflict, right?
Well, it's difficult, I would have thought, when the yuan isn't openly convertible.
Yeah, no, I would recommend
when it's on the open international market. So I think China's fairly well insulated in that respect. Although the economy is supported, of course, but not the currency.
Right. Although you do see it with like WeChat, and that it's actually the Chinese diaspora is using it kind of around the world to a certain extent. But I agree with you. It would be very difficult because it's a non-convertible currency. So let's go over to Doug Davis. What's your prediction on the new normal coming out of the pandemic and the Russian conflict?
Well, I mean, I think you got really 3 or 4 key things are going to happen. One is I agree that with the other panelists that supply chains are going to have to get shorter. There's no doubt about that. We built this entire ecosystem over the last 20 years around just-in-time inventory, and it's no longer in time. And so we're going to have to figure out not only how to shorten the supply chains, but how to be more agile, and how to quickly pivot from one supplier to the other. And you know, and literally, I think we're going to see almost supply marketplaces come in, where we have some kind of, you know, market level distributors that are helping to achieve this for, you know, of course, for a piece of the action. I think we are just starting to see the level of state actors in the cybersecurity ecosystem involving themselves in disruption of supply chains. And so that's going to be another one, both state and commercial actors in there. So I think we're going to see a huge amount of that coming forward, and it's not going to be pretty. And the ransomware is going to get higher, and it's going to be, you know, financing even more bad stuff. So every time these guys get paid, they get more money to go do it again. And then lastly, I think that, and I think Dr. Hassan said this earlier, I think we're going to have to, at a governance level, start thinking about the world as part of itself rather than just as individual countries. There's a lot of nationalism going on now. We've all spoken about this today. But until we really start wrapping our mind around the fact that we are completely and totally interdependent, and we have to work together to solve a lot of this stuff, it's just not going to get any better, and it's probably going to get worse.
Okay, very good. I mean, Luis Davila, what are your thoughts about the new normal?
Well, I think I've touched on it, and several of the panelists have touched on some of my thoughts. But I would have to agree with the last comment that that where it seems to be going, the new normal is, to me, quite disturbing, because the new normal would be that the economic powers, the political powers, would just take care of themselves, and the rest of the world would be in trouble. And as others have said, we cannot ignore the development of the last 40 years in terms of the interconnectivity that our markets have, and the importance of looking at it as one. You know, that's going to require breaking through some of this neo-nationalism that we're seeing. Stop looking inward and start looking at the global economy as a whole. You know, it's kind of alarming to look at as we sit here today versus all the progress that we had made, and it's very disheartening that we seem to be on the brink of giving up a lot of global progress that we've made. You know, we're seeing now a lot of the economic powers looking at different programs, again, understandably so, to start onshoring, bringing back supply chains closer to home, etc. And that to me makes a lot of sense, but it makes sense as contingency programs, because you always have to have those type of contingency programs when you have these global supply chains, because things happen and they can be disrupted. But I'm hoping it doesn't become the new normal. Again, that the political and economic powers decide just to take care of themselves, and you know, leave the rest of the world just fending for themselves.
Great. Okay, and final word with. We've lost Digby Wren. Okay, final word with Dr. Hassan Daud. Okay, it's been. By the way, this has been a tremendous challenge for all of us from a technology standpoint today. But go ahead. Last word with you, Dr. Hassan.
I think amongst the challenges that those were discussed in the session today, I think technology is the least of the challenges. So, you know, where we're talking about food, where we're talking about supply chains, where we're talking about leadership being introvert in terms of bringing on the protectionism that they're speaking about globally. And as a matter of fact, I was in a discussion yesterday, and I'm in Peking University right now as we speak. So I went out and I saw two Americans discussing, and they were perhaps from the different coasts. So one from one side and the other on the other side, and their impression and discussion on Russia was totally different. So this is happening across the globe, and we see in our country also politics overshadowing some of the initiatives. And I think in terms of the new normal that you've been asking each of the panelists here, I think we have to let go on few things. One would be protectionism. The other is we need to promote regionalism and globalization more. Unless we integrate more, unless we connect more, I think we will not pass on the baton to the next generation in the way that we should be. And when we talk of food security, I would just like to add one point. The overall political scenario that we have discussed, the overall shortening of China, despite the fact that we already have conflicts there, the US-China trade war already being discussed and being echoed everywhere. I think on top of that, when countries like Pakistan have floods, and the impact of that is so horrifying. I think in terms of agriculture, in terms of the food security, I think the global leader need to sit together. And I was surprised, as a matter of fact, on the discussion on SEO in this panel, where sitting in China and also looking at from the Pakistan perspective, this major event happening after 3 years in terms of physical presence of the leaders, especially President Xi Jinping and all the other global leaders. I think we need to look at things not through the lens of our politics, but also through the lens of how the world should look like. And I think SEO went quite well. And I look at the Global Development Initiative. I've been reading around it, and I think the way that the Chinese government is approaching the next month important meeting of the National Commission, I think they will be more aggressive in terms of their approach. And I think looking at their economy, they are taking some fantastic out-of-box solutions. They're lowering down the interest rate, where the rest of the economies are working by the book as per the old school philosophies. I think the old school philosophies won't work. We need to integrate more. We need more people-to-people interaction. And I think we need more economic integration.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan Daud. And we'll leave it there, folks. This has been a tremendous conversation. My thanks on behalf of AmCham Princeton Foundation to David Thomas at Kochanski Partners, Digby Wren, Dr. Digby Wren at the Mekong Research Project in Deakin University, Dr. Hassan, as I said, and Mr. Luis Davila, the former head of R.J. Reynolds International and a member of the Board of Trustees of Depauw University. And a special thanks to Dr. Doug Davis, who is professor of law at Lincoln University Law School and an AmCham Princeton senior research fellow, who has not only been answering questions very adeptly, but also helping with the technology. And by the way, Dr. Hassan, my comment wasn't about technology being a problem with regards to the conflict. It was only with regards to this conference. So, it's been a challenge. We've been, Luis Davila is in Newfoundland. We've got David Thomas in Poland, and we've got Doug Davis in Texas. So, and us here in Asia, Dr. Digby Wren and Dr. Hassan. So thank you very much on behalf of AmCham Princeton Foundation, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.